Welcome to this month's ANZPAC conference, coming to you today from Auckland in New Zealand. I'm Pete Nichols, the Chief Executive of Parents Beyond Breakup. Now, we've done quite a few of these. For those regulars, I'll save you a long intro. That said, we do have a special announcement at the end of today that you will want to stay for, so please do stay on the back of that small teaser until the end of today's conference. Today we have two local experts here from New Zealand. We have Jill Goldson, who's sat next to me, who is a mediator and a PA expert. I will get her to introduce herself properly because I don't know that I will do it justice in a moment. We also have, after Jill, Jim Smith, who is provides dad support through an organisation called Kids Need Dads. Jim sees a lot of what we would refer to as parental alienation, but I'll let him speak to his perspective on that. Now, I'll be talking to each of our guests today for about 15 minutes, followed by your audience questions. So please do submit your questions as we go through this conference. If you're here in the room using the QR code on the piece of paper on the chairs, or if you're online, it'll be posted in the chat. Please submit your question, and after we've heard from each guest, we'll put your questions to them. So without further ado, let's go to Jill. Now, Jill, it's probably best that you do introduce yourself, because I definitely won't be doing you justice, so go ahead, please.
Thank you, Pete, and welcome to everybody at this conference presentation. To introduce myself, I'll try and be really brief. It's a bit tricky because I've been doing this work for so long, but I'll speak fast. So I've worked extensively with families for at least 3 decades in Australasia and in Europe. In the last perhaps 15 years, once I stopped being a senior lecturer with tertiary degrees and diplomas in the subject, I opened my own practice, the Family Matters Centre in Auckland, where I'm the director, and it's a centre for working with families and children. On the back of that, I've increasingly been involved in the research of child involvement in parental dispute, child inclusion. So I comment to media, I train other mediators, I practice with families all the time, and then for my sins, I actually wrote a book this year, which I don't think I'll ever do again, but it's done and it's being received quite well, and it's called Child Inclusion in Parenting Dispute Mediation, the Key to Keeping Family Separation Out of Court. Of course, it covers a lot of aspects of what I think this audience will be interested in. So I think that probably is a thumbnail sketch of what I do.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Jill has joined us previously, albeit online, and we've put the 4 standard questions to her on a previous occasion that we ask of all of our guests. So I think we're going to do something a little bit different today. Not least that there is a contemporary case in the media here in New Zealand and actually internationally very recently with a dad called Tom Phillips, who unfortunately lost his life having abducted his children. Now, having flown over from Australia, I'm not that familiar with the case. And so within the realms of what you feel you can share, Jill, I know that you have spoken about it on radio and in written media here in New Zealand. Could you share with our audience your perspective on any element of the case or structures around that case that you feel you can, albeit that I think there are some legal restrictions around it, which I'm sure you're aware of?
Yes, of course. Look, an incredibly tragic case which has really transfixed the nation and, as you say, Pete, internationally. Now, my first disclaimer is that I know nothing more about this case than anybody else does. And my second disclaimer is that I am not wanting in any way to partake of shrill debates about whether Tom Phillips was a victim or a villain. What I am talking about in relation to this case are some of the wider systemic issues, which I think are of fundamental importance, and that it behoves all of us to focus on rather than the details which actually lead to a lot of skullduggery. I do have some critiques and thoughts about it, but I guess it's really important that I make those as my disclaimers. So I think one of the main things that's arisen for me in this case is that this family, notwithstanding what was going on, and we don't fully know what was going on, but this family, in my view, were failed by the systems that should have been there to support them. So to digress but relevantly, I'm talking about the out-of-court process called family dispute mediation, which obviously is the focus of my own research, and which now, as a result of that research, is a provision in this country which is fully funded and immediate for any family who's finding themselves caught up in complex and destructive dynamics, or even complex dynamics, or even just dynamics. It doesn't matter. But this is a provision which is there. Now, in the Phillips case, clearly this was a situation which was a wildfire at the time that things were starting to happen. I think my heartbreak and my critique is one aspect of this is, without fully knowing what happened, but we do know that this father came out of the bush with the children some weeks after he disappeared and was immediately given a summons to appear in court for wasting police time. Now, to me, that is a catastrophic failure of the systems that should have been managing a situation which clearly spoke of different levels of desperation. So what happened? We know. Within a very short time, this father had bolted again into the bush with the children. So my concern is the questions that should be being asked about what were the police doing, what was child protection doing, and very significantly, what was the family court doing in a situation that was obviously about contested care of the children. But to simply give this father, well, as far as we know, to simply give this father a summons to go to court for wasting police time at a time when it sounds to me as if he was defending his position as the other involved parent, and there were grandparents involved too, as I understand it, was clearly not going to be the right way to manage the situation. I think the other point I just want to make on this is that I have, as we all do, a huge amount of worry for the children involved in the case. I'm particularly worried in this situation because, as those of you who know my work will understand, my work with children is not asking children what they want. My work with children is encouraging child participation so that we can understand their emotions and their feelings from a developmental perspective. In other words, what is it like to be a child who is operating from a broken system, which is the family that they love and relate to? My concern, to go back to this tragic case, is that these children could be, I don't know that they will, but they could be asked for information about who was supporting their father whilst they were in the bush. To me, that's a very, very dangerous line of questioning for the children, and we have to ask ourselves what the point is. Are we now on a witch hunt to find people that supported this father in his time away? And do we really have the right to involve these children to expand their knowledge according to an adult narrative, given the tragic circumstances that they have just been involved in? So I put it out there as one of my very deepest concerns about the ethics of this situation. And just to sum up, I really, really hope that for all its horror and distress, that this case will at least be a wake-up call that we really need to strengthen the provisions that are there and to join up the dots of the different agencies which purport to help families in crisis. So
Okay, so I think you spoke just there about strengthening the existing system that we have. And certainly something that we see in Australia quite a bit is that the rules that exist don't always get followed to the letter or particularly well. So there is a case, I guess, for strengthening what already exists. But what systems or structures do you think need to exist that might have prevented this type of case occurring?
Well, I think inevitably, Pete, I'm going to talk about the system and structure that I have spent my life's work promoting and creating, and that is an early intervention at the time of separation before issues ossify into the horrors of what we know as parental alienation, and also an extreme case like this. We need to understand, don't we, that adversarial processes very rarely work for families. I do fully acknowledge there are some cases that need court action, but the issue of getting in soon enough and for the community to be educated about provisions that are available and for practitioners in those provisions to truly understand the wider ambit of working with families and working with families who are going through the transition of separation. We don't need to stigmatise separation. It happens all the time, but somehow it still becomes an incredibly major crisis. Of course, it's a major crisis for the parents. As professionals, we need to deconstruct that crisis into something that could be managed with some careful facilitation, mediation, and of course, the appropriate participation of the children caught up in the crisis so that the parents can hear what's happening for their children without admonishing the parents, but supporting the parents to reach solutions that are going to work for the children and indeed for the parents.
Sure. Well, looking actually specifically at your area of expertise, which is in mediation, obviously, what are your thoughts about, does mediation lack the teeth to actually enforce agreements that are made? I mean, particularly in high conflict cases where it's extremely hard to get people to actually do the right thing quite often.
Yes, I would agree it lacks the teeth. If one parent decides they don't want to do mediation, they're not mandated to do it. If there's disagreement between the parents simply after one session, it is possible for the case to proceed to court. So I'm not totally sure that mediation is taken seriously or as seriously as it should be. And I'm also concerned that the level of expertise in terms of training professionals is still lagging behind. For example, it worries me that what I call child participation is still being referred to as voice of the child. In my view, voice of the child is what lawyers for children do in court. Parents won't come to mediation if they think the child's voice, which rightly they confuse with court processes, is going to be the centre of the intervention. It's not. We don't ask children what they want, although that may come out in some way, but we hear what the children are saying and we feed that back very, very carefully in a developmental framework and in a way that is accessible for parents. Again, let's not admonish parents who are frequently caught up in one of the worst crises of their lives. It's a continuum. It can operate as a preventative measure against the worst cases of parent-child contact, which we know as alienation. I'm talking about the worst, hard end of those cases.
Certainly, look, we've heard through the course of these monthly events and just in general that there are so many campaigners out there pushing for a voice for the child. And yet we also hear from experts quite often that in itself can become a motivation for the parents to try and convince the child to take their side against the other. And I guess that's the day. On the face of it, it sounds a great idea, but in reality, it becomes a problem, or it can be a problem, I guess.
Yes, Pete, I think any polarisation is going to be the antithesis to mediation, isn't it? And so I struggle with the binaries, the shrill debates that are black and white. Everyone needs to be heard. As Shakespeare said, give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, or knits the all-fraught heart and bids it break. Everyone needs to be heard. The less you hear people, the more entrenched they become in their positions. It's not rocket science, as they say. So I think the moment people get onto really strong positions are the moment that the acrimony becomes really entrenched, and it is typically the children that bear it, and they can't bear it. And I see far too many deeply unwell children in the midst of parental conflict, and also children who are no longer in touch with one of the parents that they were deeply attached to when they were little. This is a very, very serious public health issue and needs to be understood as such.
Yeah, look, I would totally agree with that. I think we could, there's a whole bunch of questions I would love to put to you, but actually we're kind of at that point in time where we should really go to audience questions, and there's quite a few that have already come through. So, Jill, if I might put some of our audience questions to you. This one is from a professional in Australia, online, and they say, Jill, with the recent events in New Zealand, why do you think that the media focus more on an incident with a dad and his children than they do when it involves a mum?
Sorry, can you just say that last part again?
Yeah,
why
so
do they focus more
why does the media focus more on an incident with a dad and his children versus a mum and her children?
Well, I suppose it's difficult to deconstruct what has happened in this Tom Phillips situation. It's not a run-of-the-mill situation, and I think if it had involved a mum in extreme circumstances like this, I think the focus would have been equally on the circumstances surrounding it. There are other things I could say about that, but yeah, fundamentally.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you for that. We have a professional in New Zealand, and they're saying, Jill, what can we do as professionals to mitigate those systemic factors placing families into further distress? I think you've touched upon it a little bit, perhaps, but I wanted to put that question because the audience members just come through with it.
Yes. Training, discussion, not going down rabbit holes in a case like this where we're sort of trying to find out the details of what was going on in that family, but to look at the wider principles. And to be honest, this sort of opportunity that we're talking in right now is exactly what we need to be doing.
Sure, okay. Thank you for that. We have a person in the room who's put forward quite a complex question, so bear with me while I read this one out. It says the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls welcomed a September Brazilian bill that would scrap the concept of parental alienation in law. Do you have any comments around that?
Look, I really don't understand why we have to put so much precious energy into prosecuting or defending something that happens. And one of the things that I do adhere to that I like is, it was Philip Marcus, who is a retired family court judge in Israel, who said, let's call alienation parent-child contact problems. Why? It's not to detract from the reality of this very sad phenomenon, but it is because we've got to stop the whole word of alienation becoming inflammatory and actually taking hostage of any sane, quiet conversation, particularly where it goes into the family court. Parent-child contact problems is actually what alienation is, and it's on a continuum from something relatively remedial, if caught early enough sometimes, through to the entrenched horror shows that we see. And we can't pretend they don't exist either. But I think let's just watch our semantics on this so that we don't end up getting completely distracted because of arguments.
Well, I think that's such a good point. And again, that has come up quite a few times with our various guests, that it doesn't matter necessarily what you call it. The fact does exist that there are parent-child relationship disruptions. And as to your point, there is a spectrum from mild to extreme. And quite often from an academic perspective, one of the problems is that we hyper-focus on the binary. It is a case of PA or it's not a case of PA. But what if you're just below the threshold and it's a real problem anyway? So it's a spectrum. So it may or may not be helpful calling it parental alienation, but the phenomena exists, and banning the word doesn't make it go away.
No, I'm not saying ban the word. I'm saying just be careful in the use of it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a professional in Australia who said, child inclusive practice represents the developmental needs of the child in the mediation process. It is not about the wishes of the child. Would you comment? Would you agree with that?
100%. Yes.
Actually, that wasn't a question, it was a comment. My apologies, I should have said that. It was more of a comment. You didn't necessarily have to answer that, but that was a professional sharing that view. We have another professional in Australia who does have a question. It says, what therapeutic interventions do you believe can be useful prior to mediation and an escalation to court?
Well, I suppose the therapeutic interventions that I use in my own family matters practice is a very close cousin to mediation. I mean, it's all me with various hats on. So I will often say to families who come to see me, or typically parents, we can turn this into family dispute resolution easily. It's just an admin task, but let's just see if we can deconstruct this into something manageable now before it really flares up into something major. So to try and answer that question, good mediation is always going to be a relative of good family therapy, not elongated, because families in crisis don't have the luxury of time, but targeted, but understanding family dynamics, family systems, child development. And I suppose my rejoinder to that is also, please, can we get the training right? This is something that doesn't need a long and complex training, but people need to understand what they're doing and why they are doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We have another question from a professional in Australia. Jill, could you provide an example of successful mediation or therapeutic interventions that saved the family from the stress of court?
Let me count the ways. Look, that's not to big note and say that you can tick the box of everybody, because some cases are so hard. But because I've got the benefit of a lot of experience and a lot of training, I do have to say, whilst remaining deeply humble in the face of every new case, that I do have good results. So I will give a thumbnail sketch of one case, which I use shamelessly in a lot of my presentations because I think it's the perfect metaphor. And that is a very, very high conflict, actually a very high profile couple who came to see me. Their little boy was in and out of the children's hospital with organic tummy pains. They knew something wasn't right. I talked to the child, and it turned out from this little boy, when we talked, he was 7, in a child appropriate discussion with his participation with me, without the parents, which is how I work in what we call the Goldson model. So I see the children. I'm also the same person who sees the parents, and that's a really important part of the way I work. This little boy said to me, my biggest problem in the whole world is that at Dad's new house, I'm allowed to choose the colour of the paint for my new bedroom, and Jill, I can't choose because Mummy loves green and Daddy loves blue. obviously it goes without saying, what was key in that message was that when I related this back to the parents, very carefully, no admonishment, just, this is something your little boy has told me, and he said it was fine for me to talk about it, which is a whole other topic, children confidentiality, but in this case, you could have heard a pin drop. They had no idea that the degree of their conflict had intruded so far into this little boy's emotional development that he was unable to choose a colour, as his 7-year-old peers can, as his favourite colour. I won't say that they went on to be best buddies, his mum and dad, but they certainly dropped the conflict and found other ways to manage it. And the little boy, who actually happened to ring me, he's now 25, but he didn't forget that. And he rang me about one of his first heartbreaks not so long ago. So the reason I put that bit in is because, we do this for families, but the role modelling that children experience, that when you are confronted with a really shocking crisis, as children understand their parents are, and indeed as they are, and then you see your mum and dad doing something, like finding a way through it, and you are involved to support that, clearly has a long-lasting impact on that child into their own adulthood.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have a professional here from Australia. Parental conflict impacts the children. What fundamentals do you recommend in mediating high conflict parents?
Sorry, just say that again.
Parental conflict impacts the children. What
yes.
fundamentals do you recommend in mediating high conflict parents?
Well, I think really that's the whole point of child inclusion, so thank you for that question. But child inclusion, child participation, when augmented with an understanding of what happens to children when they're caught in the irresolute conflict, is something that parents really hear. Because if they agree on nothing else, parents typically do care about what's going to happen to their child. And so I think it's incumbent on those working in these situations to make sure that they are familiar with some of the key research pieces on parental conflict and its impact on children. And if I've said it once, I'll say it over and over. We cannot admonish and patronise parents who are in deep distress. We need to find that balance between advocating for their children while supporting them as parents in distress and helping them to become the best parents that they can be to their child, because that in the end is going to be what they really want underneath it all.
Thank you. So we have a parent in New Zealand watching online. Their question is kind of strays perhaps slightly into the legal, but based on your experience of working in the sector. The question here is, how do I get the child's lawyer, and I guess this will be in New Zealand, so local practice, how do I get the child's lawyer to act in good faith with open discussions before going to court?
It's difficult to really comment without going into the job description for the child's lawyer. We understand that lawyer for child is there to represent the child's welfare and best interests, which we are in the out-of-court process as well. It's obviously similar, but the differences are very, very significant. And if you just think about the terms, the voice of the child versus child participation. Children tell us in substantial research that they don't like talking to strangers about what's going on in their families. And that's why I work as I do, because I can say to children, do you know what, I've met your mum and your dad, and I really like both of them, and I almost feel like I know you because I've heard so much about you. tell me how you're feeling about what's happening with mum and dad at the moment. So I am familiar without being family. Of course I'm a stranger and I keep my involvement very minimal because I don't like children to be constantly talking to outsiders about their situation. But the fact that the children know that their mum and dad both agree that their parents, want them, the child, to come and talk to me, and I can then say, I know your mum and dad, I've met them, it's been good to work with them, I like them both, I know there are some problems, basically supports that process. It is different from lawyer for child, which is a court-appointed position.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question here from New Zealand, local. It's a dad who's online watching today. Says, thank you. How do I, as a father, get shared custody after separation? What cases can I use that will prove that the child's best interest is in shared custody?
Well, that's a fairly legal question, isn't it? And it's really a sort of legal advocacy position from the little I understand about it. And I think my response to that would be, if you haven't already tried mediation, please do, because really the child's best interests are always going to be served by parental agreement about what's going to work best for the child, which is kind of a hazardous statement to make when you consider how at odds with each other parents are when they are in a high conflict situation. But with skilled mediation and child participation, we can get a lot more traction on that sort of case than otherwise. So cases that one can illustrate are best done with the same parents in the same room, rather than in a courtroom where people are paying eye-watering amounts of money and are incredibly stressed, and typically their children will be distressed too.
Jill, thank you. I think we've come to the time where we're going to have to draw a line under. The questions are still coming through. It's awesome to have you here and people want to keep talking to you. I'll be making an announcement at the end of today's short conference, about how that could occur in the future with Jill and others. But for now, I'm just going to say thank you, Jill, for spending the time with us. Maybe you want to show your book and just do a bit of a plug. I've actually begun to read it, and it's actually very good. It's very, very good.
Thank you. Child Inclusion in Parenting Dispute Mediation, the Key to Keeping Family Separation Out of Court. I wrote it because I felt I just had to write it. I don't want to ever do it again. But if you'd like to get hold of it, it's on Amazon. It's in various retail outlets in New Zealand. It's also in the public library system, I've just found out. So I'm going to be doing some Q&As on it, no charge, at the public libraries. It's also available as an ebook through Amazon. So thank you for that opportunity.
That's exactly where I found it. I just typed your name, Jill Goldson, into Amazon, and it popped up straight away. And I think it's actually included, if you've got an Amazon ongoing agreement where you can just read so many books for free, it's actually included in that.
Oh, is it?
So yeah, if you're an Amazon member, you may find that it's free to read online. I still think you get a fee out of it. But look, thank you once again, Jill. It's been awesome having you. Some of the questions I know were not kind of centered around your particular area of background, but you know.
No, they were all really good questions, and I would love to keep going. So thank you to those who are tuned in for listening.
Well, look, we're going to take a short break now. We'll be back very soon with our next guest, Jim Smith. So we'll catch you soon.